In the last segment, we talked about the infamous 1919 Anglo-Persian agreement that at the end Iran refused to participate, and I mentioned that there were some acts of terror committed by the liberals against those who were supporting it, and so the British decided that it's not worth pursuing this any longer. But I ended pointing out that they still had not given up on the idea of keeping Iran on a short leash. So they tried something else, and that something else is captured by the 1921 military coup, which was really pulled by one Reza Khan. So in 1921, the British planned and actually helped execute the coup, and their plan was that this coup will lead to a type of pattern of change that they knew they could live with, but at the same time would allow Iran to become more stable. And this was what we call the controlled change formula. So you have to go back to the early lectures where we talked about the controlled change formula. So the pattern that they wanted was essentially an alliance of, on the one hand, traditional elites or class, together with the technocratic elites, and at this stage, technocratic really meant mostly the military, and some elements of bourgeoisie, because they're beginning to realize that this newly elements of merchant and the bazaar and the newly emergent bourgeoisie are going to be important. The coup was officially done by one Sayyid Ziauddin Tabatabai. He was, by all evidence, there's hardly any reason to even have any doubt about that, he was a flat-out British agent, and they brought in addition to this Tabatabai, they brought in a very tough colonel from Iran's Kazakh brigade. His name was Reza Khan. The Reza Khan was supposed to provide the security for the country, and Sayyid Zia became the prime minister. He lasted only 3 months. And then the British sent him to Palestine to wait for his next opportunity again. By the way, as a kind of a digression, I want to point out that the British were very good when they had a smart agent, and they generally took very good care of their agents. They made him, secretly they made him a citizen, and as I said, they did whatever they can to make sure that they have a refuge in case they had to go back to England. But as the coup progresses, it becomes increasingly obvious to all that Reza Khan is the real power. And soon you will see that he will become Reza Shah, Shah meaning the word Shah in Farsi is equivalent of king. Now, because Reza Khan began his rise with a British-assisted coup, you can imagine he is going to run into legitimacy problem, especially with the liberal pro-change elites. So in the period between Reza Khan becoming the king and the coup in 1921, you have a succession of weak governments. Nominally, the dynasty in charge is still the Qajar dynasty. But now we have a regime that is moving pretty quickly toward authoritarianism as opposed to a traditional rule. Reza Khan was in many ways a tough and in other ways a ruthless man, but he was also an exceptional man. And he ends up dramatically changing Iran. So in 1925, Reza Khan becomes Reza Shah. It's the end of the Qajar dynasty. That dynasty is replaced by the Pahlavi dynasty. I should point out that in many ways Reza Khan was trying to emulate a mentor and a counterpart also at the same time in terms of a contemporaneous mentor by the name of Ataturk, the father of modern Turkey. So he really wanted to make Iran into a republic, emphasizing the modernity and the secular part of it. And he wanted to become a president of that new republic. But it was the conservative clerics that interceded and asked him not to abandon monarchy and become a king. So Reza Shah, his own idea was to be a president of a republic, but with the insistence and the pressure from the clerics, he decided to become a king. It is one of the examples of the cunning of history that Reza Khan, who wanted to be Iran's president, ends up to be Iran's king, and a person who wanted to create a republic is persuaded by the anti-change clerics to become a founder of a new monarchy. And that monarchy will be Iran's last, ending in the hands of the clerics, who then establish a republic, albeit an Islamic one. The Pahlavi dynasty, therefore, you have its founder, Reza Khan, becoming Reza Shah, and it's going to be Iran's last monarchy, as I mentioned. So what I want to talk next is about Iran's control system as it shifts with Reza Shah becoming the king. So the period is 1925. Reza Shah now is in control, and you will see that the control system again changes. Going back to our familiar three areas of primary, secondary, and tertiary, at the sea level, that is the coercion part of it, you will see that the coercion is targeting three distinct groups. First, before I get to the target, I should point out that the coercion is no longer foreign. It is indigenous. Reza Shah is quickly training the rural police, gendarmerie, and the police in the capital and the army. So now, instead of foreigners imposing or enforcing laws as well as controlling the population, you have the indigenous population. The targets are first and foremost liberal intellectual leaders. And the way he goes about neutralizing them is very, very effective. Very early on, you get a highly liberal newspaper publisher who was strangled, and then the rest of the people got the message. So you have the liberal intellectuals being coerced, so you know right off the bat that they're not going to like Reza Shah. In fact, they hate him. Second group that are being coerced are the landed aristocracy and the tribes. Remember now, these people exercise a lot of power given the feudal structure of the Iranian society and the rural nature of its economy. Reza Shah had to bring them under his control if he were to modernize Iran and pick Iran up by the bootstrap. He ordered the tribe to stop migrating between the seasons, which was a very common pattern, because in the winter they would go south, in the summer they would come north, and in the process they would be planting. A lot of them actually end up dying because his decision to prevent them from migrating. He also terrorized any recalcitrant tribal chief. In fact, our own chief, one of our Supreme Court justices by the name of Justice William Douglas describes in his book and travelogue in southern Iran during that period that there was a game called the headless body game that used to be played. He used to cut the head of one of these tribal chief, and the body would be just sitting there without the head to give the message to the rest of them. So he did truly terrorize the tribes. And again, you can imagine tribal people didn't like him. Now remember, the aim is to centralize power in Iran. The tribal elements were very autonomous, and since he couldn't get them to comply, he decided to use terror against them, and it largely worked. With the large landowners, he played a very different game. A lot of them died mysteriously in the north and in the Caspian Sea region, and he took possession of their land. So the landowning class was also being terrorized, and they also fell into compliance. And finally, he cracked down on the religious leader, the third group. And the religious leaders here were pretty much, some of them were killed, and he put them on a very, very short leash. And especially those religious leaders who were inclined to get the masses to rise up against him by playing around with the symbols of Islam. So this was the way coercion was being used for the purpose of establishing centralized authority in a society that was feudal, in a society that the landlords and the tribal elements really controlled the countries outside of the capital and the major cities. Now, there was one more element that actually redounded to Reza Shah's favor in terms of him being able to establish control. Now, throughout this period, many Iranians truly believed that Reza Shah was ultimately a British agent. And the reason for that perspective was understandable. After all, the coup was British assisted. Therefore, these people assumed that if Reza Shah's rule is threatened by any opposition group, British will come and will save him. So psychologically, that actually ended up working in favor of the Reza Shah, because this belief took the wind out of the sails of the oppositions. And therefore, they resigned themselves to this fact, and it robbed the opposition of its sense of efficacy. Remember now, this is related in part to the colonial stereotype that I mentioned, that there's no way you can stand up to the imperial masters. And if you have somebody doing something good, it's because the imperial masters wanted it that way. And if you oppose them, they're going to come and save them. So this pretty much covers the first element in his control, the importance of coercion. Next was the utilitarian. Initially, Reza Shah was interested in two groups. One was to make sure those who were in charge of the coercion, that is the police, the army officers, and so on, they got well paid. So the coercive force became a major beneficiary of getting well paid. He created officer clubs, and they remained very, very loyal to him. So that was another factor that helped him stay in power. Very few people could challenge him if you have a loyal force that is going to protect you. Secondly, he allowed commerce to develop. And again, it's part of his thinking as a modernist that you got to go beyond the bazaar. You got to go beyond the kind of a rural economy, and you got to start thinking in terms of industrialization. So he allowed commerce to develop, and he brought security to Iran because it was needed for commerce to develop. And you also needed the infrastructure for Iran to move toward modernity. So he built a nationwide railroad system. He built a lot of paved roads, which really didn't exist until he came to power, and literally created a modern transportation system for Iran. So in short, he gave Iran a great deal of the rudiments of a modern infrastructure that a modern state would need. So commerce began to flow into the cities of Iran, and soon the merchants who began to see the benefits of his public works began to use the roads and began to take advantage of the infrastructure, decided that he is pretty good, and began to leave the liberal camps. Now remember, the liberal camps included the liberal elites, the merchants, and the progressive religious leader. So now the merchants part of it are beginning to enjoy the benefits of a stability and a centralized authority, the rule of law that was being established under Reza Shah. But it's also important not to delude oneself. For the merchants, liberal values were always instrumental value. They were not terminal values. They were instrumental. It served their purpose. So long as the commerce flows, it's not that important. Whereas for the intellectual, those values are much more vital than it is for the merchants. Normative habitual. Remember now, even in 1925, Iran, as it moves toward a mass political society, these are really baby steps and very early in the process of change. Iran is predominantly, more than 90%, a pre-mass political society. And in that sense, you're looking at the country being comprised of peasants and villagers in the tune of about 90%. For the most part, therefore, they were acquiescent, and therefore the norms didn't really matter very much. So even if NH is at this level, it doesn't mean that the country has experienced major normative change. Finally, NA is still at the low level. Again, that relates to the fact that Iran is a pre-mass political society, but also Reza Shah had a major liability trying to manipulate nationalist symbol. The one that he wanted to manipulate very hard, because he believed in it, was Iran itself as a national symbol. But the problem was he could not get away with it, given that he got into power with the help of the British coup. But by all measure, he was truly an Iranian nationalist, and he wanted to free himself of the British control, and he proceeded to do that. As far as religious symbols are concerned, Reza Shah never really liked Islam. He seemed to have been much more attracted to the pre-Islamic faith of Iran, which was Zoroastrianism at the time, the state religion of Iran. He suppressed Islamic religious symbols, and he put the clerics under a very tight leash. And because of that, therefore, he denied himself the use of religious symbols. Instead, he was limited to manipulating modernity as a symbol. He couldn't use Iran so much as a symbol because of his relations with the coup in 1921, being seen as a agent of the British. He couldn't use religion, so the only other symbol that was left for him to manipulate was modernity. And with modernity, Iran being at a pre-mass political stage, you couldn't reach a large number of people. So by fiat, he declared women will no longer be veiled as a modern society that Iran was trying to be. Again, remember, modern symbols for him was very natural. By taking on Islam, he really had no other choice. So modernity becomes the only other symbol for him. And what else follows from that? Well, if you want to be modern, you better be educated. So he's going to spend a lot of country's resources to create a new educational system. And the new educational system going to replace the Quranic maktab, which was predominant. Students are now able to get modern educations. He's going to send a lot of Iranian who are willing to serve in the army to go abroad and get a foreign education. So at the end, he ends up nationalizing and modernizing Iran's entire educational system. Again, part of this move to modernize Iran as fast as he could.